The auditorium was silent in the way that only important moments demand, thick with anticipation and the soft hum of camera equipment. Bright studio lights washed over rows of students seated in neat symmetry, their faces a mix of nerves, pride, and restless excitement. At the center of it all stood a small figure, barely tall enough to see over the podium without stretching. She clutched her certificate with trembling hands, her shoulders drawn tight, her heart pounding with a hope she had carried for years. This moment was supposed to be hers, earned, undeniable, millions. Watched from their screens as the broadcast proudly announced excellence, resilience, and the promise of a better future. But behind the polished words and forced smiles, something darker waited just beneath the surface. A single decision, fueled by long-buried prejudice, was about to shatter the celebration in front of a live audience. As the award was lifted into the air, sudden movement cut through the ceremony like a blade. What followed happened so fast that many viewers would later question whether they had truly seen it. Paper tore. Gasps rippled. The girl stood frozen, her dream collapsing in front of her in real time. In a matter of seconds, an act of quiet cruelty became a public spectacle. And just as quickly, regret would arrive, sharp, immediate, and impossible to escape. Because what was done in that moment would set off a chain of events no one in that room or watching at home was prepared for. This was not just an accident. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The reckoning that began in that frozen moment. On stage had roots stretching back far beyond the bright lights of the auditorium and the sudden tear of paper. It was seated years earlier in the quiet corners of a public school built on the edge of a divided town, where opportunity and limitation often walked the same hallways but never touched hands. The girl at the center of the storm had grown up, learning to move carefully through a world that rarely slowed down for her. Her childhood unfolded in a small apartment shared with a mother who worked double shifts and a grandmother whose stories carried both pain and unbreakable pride. Every morning before school began the same way, early alarms, quick breakfasts, tightly braided hair, and whispered reminders that excellence was not optionally, was survival. From the very beginning, she learned that she would be judged twice as harshly for half the room and twice as invisibly for the other. Still, she learned to shine in silence by the time she reached middle school. Her name began to appear in places where teachers once only saw her pass by unnoticed. Perfect attendance, top of the class, quiet leadership. She did not demand attention. It followed her anyway, drawn by consistency and discipline. Some educators admired her work from afar, quietly impressed but distant. Others viewed her success through a lens clouded by assumptions they never questioned. In certain classrooms, praise felt measured, as if too much recognition might disrupt an unspoken order. Among those classrooms was the one taught by the educator, would later stand beside her on the stage. Years in the profession had hardened. That teacher's outlook, shaped by personal disappointments and an unexamined belief system, passed down like an heirloom. The class had always been handled with rigid control, strict rules, and selective expectations. Some students were granted patience, others were given pressure. The girl learned early that she belonged to the second group. Her work was inspected. More closely, her mistakes remembered longer. Her victories met with muted acknowledgement. Yet she never stopped. She stayed late after school, poring over textbooks in dim libraries, submitting polished essays, volunteering for activities others avoided. Each achievement became another brick in a foundation she hoped would one day lift. Her beyond the boundaries quietly placed around her. Her family watched with cautious optimism. They celebrated every certificate taped to the refrigerator, every mention at school assemblies, every late-night study session that stole sleep but promised possibility. When the announcement of the televised academic award finally came, it felt unreal. The program was known for honoring exceptional students from underrepresented communities, broadcasting their triumphs to millions. It was the kind of recognition that could change the trajectory of a young life overnight. Teachers submitted nominations, administrators reviewed records, and a panel made the final choice. Her academic file spoke louder than any recommendation ever could. The decision was clear to everyone involved. except one. The educator who bristled at her success learned of the nomination through official channels. Alon whispers. It landed. With the weight of personal offense, rather than professional pride, years of quiet resentment, subtle bias, and unchallenged assumptions surfaced at once. What should have been a moment of shared accomplishment became, in that teacher's mind, a disruption of a hierarchy they had long accepted as natural. Still, the process moved forward. The paperwork was signed. The cameras were booked. The stage was set. The school prepared for the broadcast with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for rare moments of public recognition. Hallways filled with posters celebrating achievement. Administrators rehearsed their smiles. Students buzzed with excitement, knowing one of their own would stand in front of a national audience. For many, the girl's success felt like a collective victory. For her family, it felt like the slow unfolding of a promise they had prayed over for years. The afternoon of the ceremony arrived, wrapped in nervous energy. Makeup artists dusted faces under hot lights. Technicians checked microphones and angles with impersonal efficiency. Teachers were lined up according to protocol, suits pressed, badges polished. The girl was guided to a waiting area behind the curtain, her certificate already printed and placed into an elegant folder bearing the emblem of the broadcast network. Her hands shook as she held it earlier, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what it represented. Behind the scenes, tension brewed in ways invisible to the audience. The educator stood stiffly among the faculty, rehearsing motions instead of congratulations. With every passing second, the walls built by years of unchecked bias grew thinner under the pressure of live television. Pride clashed with prejudice. Professional duty wrestled with personal belief. And as the countdown toward the broadcast ticked down in glowing red numbers, the choice that would soon be made hardened into resolve. Out in the seats, her classmates waited with held breath. At home, her mother sat on the edge of an aging sofa, hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her grandmother whispered prayers into the quiet space between heartbeats. Across the country, strangers tuned in, expecting inspiration, celebration, and hope. No one yet understood that the stage was not merely set for recognition. It was set for exposure. In the moment the broadcast signal went live, every hidden conviction in that room would be tested under unforgiving light. The broadcast signal went live without ceremony, slipping quietly from rehearsal into reality. A red light blinked on above the main camera, unseen by most but powerful enough to turn every movement into permanent record. The auditorium, once filled with restless anticipation, settled into an unnatural stillness shaped by awareness. Every breath, every step, every expression now carried weight. The program unfolded with polished efficiency. Opening music swelled through the speakers. A host's practiced cadence filled the room with rehearsed warmth. Highlights of past winners played across massive screens, each story crafted to inspire. Each face framed as proof that determination could overcome circumstance. The audience clapped on cue, smiles rising and falling in rhythm with the production. Behind the curtain, the girl waited. Her fingers traced the embossed edges of the certificate folder, a grounding gesture learned through years of controlling nerves and managing expectations. Backstage corridors buzzed with controlled chaos. Coordinators whispered instructions. Assistants passed clipboards and headsets. The educator who would soon share the stage kept to the side. Posture rigid, gaze drifting toward the floor rather than the screen. Every moment magnified the conflict that had been festering in silence. What had once appeared as minor discomfort during daily lessons now swelled into something far more dangerous under the pressure of national visibility. When the segment introducing the current honoree approached, a hush fell over the room. The girl's name appeared on the teleprompter. A short montage began rolling images of classrooms, libraries, and award ceremonies clipped together with soft music and glowing captions detailing academic excellence, volunteer work, and overwhelming consistency. The audience watched a life briefly summarized in seconds. Applause began even before the montage ended. It was not thunderous yet, but it carried genuine warmth. From the waiting area, she stepped forward when guided. The curtains parted just enough for stage lights to spill across her face. The brightness stung her eyes at first, forcing them to narrow as she took in the vastness of the space. Rows upon rows of faces blurred together into a single wave of human presence. Her heartbeat thudded against her chest, loud enough that it nearly drowned out the applause swelling around her. Each step toward the stage felt heavier than the last, not from doubt, but from the pressure of what this moment meant. It was the visible reward for years of sacrifice no camera had captured. The early mornings, the long nights, the quiet resilience forged in spaces where expectation was low and obstacles were high. As she approached the center of the stage, her posture remained upright, practiced through countless moments of needing to appear composed even when the weight of the world pressed down. The educator moved to meet her, according to the program's choreography. To the producer's eye, it would appear seamless. Student approaches. Teacher presents the award. Cameras capture the exchange. Applause follows. Simple, clean, predictable. Yet beneath the surface, it was anything but. As the educator lifted the certificate folder for the camera, the polished exterior reflected the stage lights in a sharp glare. The hands holding it were steady, but the stillness felt artificial. Forced into place by years of training that masked internal turmoil, the girl extended her own hands, ready to receive what had long been promised. For a fleeting second, time seemed to slow. Fingers brushed the glossy surface. The air itself felt suspended. Then the tension broke. The movement was sudden and unmistakable. The folder was pulled back with a sharp motion. In the same instant, the certificate inside was ripped cleanly down the center. The sound was soft but violent, a dry tearing that sliced through the applause as if someone had severed a live wire. Paper split. Recognition shattered. Gasps rippled across the auditorium in widening waves of disbelief. The applause faltered, then collapsed into stunned silence. On stage, the girl's hands remained extended for a heartbeat too long, frozen in a posture of receiving what no longer existed. Her eyes dropped to the torn pieces now hanging uselessly in the air between them. Confusion surged first, then hurt. Then a blankness, born of shock, too large to process all at once. The cameras captured everything. The sudden movement, the tearing sound, the collective intake of breath from hundreds of witnesses. Viewers at home leaned forward, unsure of what they had seen, but certain of what they felt. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The educator's face shifted in real time as the weight of the act registered. The initial expression of grim resolve faltered under the immediate feedback of the room. Disbelief mirrored across the girl's face, reflected back through the lenses of multiple cameras. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with meaning. The production team hesitated. Cutting away would have been an admission that the moment had exceeded the bounds of acceptable broadcast mishap. But the feed continued. The director, uncertain whether this was scripted drama or catastrophic deviation, held the shot. The decision would soon prove irreversible. On stage, the girl stood unmoving, as though rooted in place. Her mind raced through possibilities in an attempt to make sense of the senseless. This was not part of any rehearsal. This was not a mistake of staging. This was deliberate. The realization settled like ice in her stomach. The recognition meant for her had been destroyed not by accident, but by intention. In the audience, reactions fractured along invisible lines. Some faces twisted in shock. Others stiffened with discomfort. A few remained unreadable, as though unwilling to acknowledge the weight of what had just occurred. Classmates seated together exchanged frantic glances, struggling to reconcile the ceremony they had waited for with the cruelty unfolding before them, far beyond the auditorium. Living rooms across the country had fallen into the same stunned quiet. Phones were lifted. Screens were recorded. Social media feeds began to stir with the first frantic posts questioning what had just happened. Millions of witnesses were being born in real time. The girl's family watched in paralyzed disbelief. Her mother's hands flew to her mouth, her body tilting forward as if proximity to the screen could change what her eyes confirmed. Her grandmother's whispered prayers broke into trembling fragments, interrupted by shock, too heavy for words. Years of hope stood on the brink of collapse in a single violent gesture. On stage, the aftermath unfolded in slow, painful increments. The torn certificate slipped from the educator's grip, fragments fluttering to the polished floor at the girl's feet. The sound of paper touching wood echoed like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to read. The girl did not bend to pick it up. She remained upright, her face flooding with heat, her chest tightening as the full humiliation pressed in from all sides. The educator's posture wavered. What had felt like controlled defiance seconds earlier now stood exposed beneath blinding light. The audience's silence was no longer neutral. It had become accusatory. The stares bore down with newfound intensity. Stripping away the comfort of invisibility that prejudice often relies upon to survive, in the control room, panic surged. Producers scrambled through possibilities, cut to commercial, redirect the segment, damage control. But the broadcast had already crossed a line from recoverable awkwardness into public transgression. There was no rewind for live television, no eraser for millions of witnessing eyes. Security staff shifted uneasily along the walls. Administrators seated in the front row stiffened, their expressions tightening as the implications raced ahead of official response. The carefully curated image of the institution cracked in plain view, revealing fault lines long ignored. The girl finally lowered her hands. The movement was small, but heavy with meaning. It signaled the end of expectation and the beginning of endurance. The applause that had welcomed her moments earlier did not return. It was replaced by a dense, suffocating quiet laden with shame, confusion, outrage, and disbelief layered together without resolution. Within that silence, the educator began to feel it, the sudden transition from perceived authority to exposed vulnerability. The power that had fueled the act melted rapidly under the heat of public scrutiny. The audience was no longer a passive backdrop. It had become a mirror, reflecting the ugliness of what had just occurred. Every second that followed stretched longer than the last. The cameras lingered. The room held its breath. The girl remained standing at center stage, alone beneath the lights. Her accomplishment transformed into spectacle. And in that moment, as the magnitude of the act spread outward through screens and networks and living rooms across the nation, the true consequences began to take shape. What had been intended as a quiet assertion of control had detonated into a visible act of injustice. The private bias once sheltered within classroom walls was now fully illuminated for the world to judge. The rising tension no longer belonged only to the girl. It surged through the auditorium, through the broadcast, through the audience at home. The question was no longer whether what happened was wrong. The question had become how the world would respond now that it had seen it happen. The response began as a tremor and escalated into an earthquake. What had first rippled through the room as shock now surged outward with accelerating force, amplified by millions of screens reflecting the same moment from every angle. The silence inside the auditorium finally broke not with applause, but with movement. Administrators shifted urgently in their seats. Staff along the walls leaned into earpieces. The smooth machinery of live television strained under the weight of an unscripted moral crisis. The educator stood, rigid at center stage. The torn remains of the awards scattered at their feet like evidence too public to hide. The confidence that had once been drawn from quiet authority drained rapidly, replaced by something closer to panic. The power imbalance that had existed in the classroom dissolved under the unforgiving symmetry of the broadcast lens. For the first time, the teacher was not the hidden judge. The world was. The girl remained still beneath the lights, her body small against the vastness of the stage, yet suddenly unmistakably central to everything. Cameras tightened their focus. The broadcast no longer framed her as a recipient of honor, but as the living focal point of a violation that could not be reframed as misunderstanding or error. Her face, taut with restraint, became the image imprinted across screens nationwide. The embarrassment she felt was immediate and searing. But beneath it, something else was rising and unspoken. Determination shaped by years of learning how to endure without breaking. Behind the curtain, the production team fractured into competing instincts to protect the integrity of the program, to cut the feed, to preserve the image of the institution, to confront the reality unfolding in real time. The director hesitated for a fraction too long. That hesitation sealed everything into history. The cameras stayed live. The world kept watching. Then the audience reaction shifted from stunned passivity to visible unrest. A low collective murmur spread through the rows like wind across tall grass. It grew unevenly at first, then stronger, fueled by the shared recognition that this was not a moment to remain silent. Faces hardened. Bodies leaned forward. The weight of communal disapproval pressed inward toward the stage. Within seconds, the broadcast detonated across the digital world. Clips were clipped and compressed and launched into the endless corridors of social media. View counts multiplied faster than any production metric could track. Headlines began to write themselves in real time. What had occurred in an auditorium now existed simultaneously in millions of private spaces, each witness forming a judgment that no official statement could preempt. The administrative leaders nearest the stage rose from their seats, urgency overtaking ceremony. Protocol dissolved into improvisation. Security personnel edged closer, not in defense of authority, but in recognition that public outrage was no longer theoretical. It was palpable. It moved like heat through the room. The educator's posture began to change under that pressure. Shoulders that had once been squared in certainty drew inward. The stillness that followed the tearing of the certificate was no longer controlled. It was brittle. The realization arrived in layers. First, the awareness of having crossed a line, then the awareness of being seen crossing it, and finally the comprehension that the act, now detached from its intended justification, stood naked as what it was. The girl finally shifted her gaze upward, away from the pieces at her feet, and toward the audience beyond the lights. What she saw was no longer a sea of faceless spectators. It was a field of witnesses, some stricken, some angered, some ashamed, many reflective. This was the first time she understood the full reach of what had happened to her. The humiliation had not been private, it had been multiplied. But so had the accountability. In the control room, hands trembled over switches and sliders. A decision was made too late to erase what had occurred, but early enough to shape what followed. The camera widened its frame. The torn certificate, the unyielding posture of the student, the shifting weight of the adult beside her, and the stirring unrest of the audience were all captured in a single, unbroken shot. No edit could soften it. No angle could excuse it. Across the country, reactions crystallized into outrage. The clip spread faster than explanation could chase it. School districts, advocacy groups, journalists, and civil rights organizations began to converge around the moment as if drawn by gravity. The act was no longer isolated to one school or one ceremony. It was being interpreted as a symbol, a confirmation of what countless families had always known but often struggled to prove. Inside the auditorium, pressure peaked. A senior administrator stepped decisively toward the stage, abandoning the polished restraint expected of televised events. The movement itself was a breach of the performance that signaled the escalation from ceremony to consequence. The physical distance between authority and accountability collapsed. The educator's face tightened as the magnitude of the situation fully settled. This was no longer an impulsive assertion of bias. It was a public reckoning unfolding without pause. The reactions in the room, the unrest from the audience, the swelling force of external scrutiny pressing in through invisible digital channels, everything converged into a single, unavoidable truth. There would be no quiet resolution. The girl stood at the center of it all, no longer simply an honoree denied recognition, but the living representation of an injustice too visible to ignore. She felt the weight of the moment not as empowerment, but as gravity-heavy, unavoidable, inescapable. The years that had taught her composure now held her steady when the world shifted violently around her. In the span of minutes, consequences began to fall into motion with domino precision. Communications teams scrambled. Legal counsel was notified. Institutional defenses rose even as the moral ground beneath them eroded. The machinery of damage control roared to life, but it lagged behind the speed of public conscience. No statement drafted in haste could outrun the clarity of what millions had already seen with their own eyes. The room vibrated with overlapping tensions, outrage, fear, disbelief, and something else more fragile and rare: recognition. Recognition that this had not been an unfortunate misunderstanding. Recognition that power had been misused openly. Recognition that the lines so often blurred behind closed classroom doors now stood sharply drawn under public light. The educator attempted to steady their breathing, but the effort only emphasized the loss of control. The mask of authority that had once felt inseparable from identity slipped under the collective gaze. What remained was exposed, humanity flawed, accountable, and cornered by consequence. The girl, still framed beneath the lights, felt none of the triumph that recognition was meant to deliver. Yet within the humiliation, something irreversible had been set in motion. The act meant to diminish her had instead ignited something far larger than either of them. The injustice had crossed the threshold from private harm to public evidence. And as the pressure inside the auditorium reached its breaking point, administrators moving, staff signaling, the audience stirring with increasing unrest, the moment tipped fully from shock into confrontation. The past could no longer hide behind authority. The present refused to look away. This was the instant when everything changed. When an act meant to erase became impossible to deny. When a single torn certificate transformed into a national indictment. When the question ceased to be what had happened and became what would now be done in front of everyone. What followed was not loud at first. It was measured, procedural, and deliberate, but every movement carried the weight of an irreversible shift. The senior administrator who had stepped forward now stood between the girl and the educator. It's not as a barrier of protection alone, but as a visible signal that the balance of power in the room had changed. The broadcast microphones captured the subtle sounds of motion. Fabric brushing fabric, shoes against polished wood, the faint echo of restrained urgency. The cameras remained live as the administrator guided the girl gently away from the torn pieces on the floor. The gesture was quiet but unmistakable. It restored, in some small way, the dignity that had been publicly stripped from her moments earlier. She walked off the center of the stage, not in defeat but in stunned silence. Her steps steady only because years of discipline had trained her to remain composed even when her world fractured beneath her feet. The audience rose slowly, not in celebration, but in recognition. The applause that followed was scattered, uneven, tangled with guilt and anger and solidarity. It was not the applause she had earned, but it was what remained when celebration had been stolen. The educator was escorted in the opposite direction. No dramatic confrontation unfolded on camera. No shouting. No spectacle of removal meant for ratings. There was only the unmistakable symbolism of separation. The power once assumed as permanent was now provisional, fragile, and publicly questioned. The act that had been intended as a quiet assertion of control now stood as a public confession of bias. The broadcast cut to an unscheduled break. The program's polished narrative collapsed into emergency messaging and silent screens. But outside the controlled bubble of network television, the story exploded. Within minutes, the clip dominated digital platforms. Millions watched and rewatched the same few seconds, each viewing stripping away any interpretation that might soften what had occurred. Discussion turned into outrage. Outrage turned into investigation. Investigation turned into consequence. By the following morning, educator had been placed on immediate administrative leave pending formal review. The institution released a statement dense with language, emphasizing seriousness, process, and accountability. It was the language of damage control, but for the first time, was being forced to keep pace with a public that no longer accepted vague reassurances. Parents demanded answers. Students demanded action. Advocacy organizations rallied around the case as yet another visible example of what had operated invisibly for generations. The girl returned home that night, not with a trophy or a certificate, but with the weight of unwanted visibility. Her family gathered around her in quiet support. There were no triumphant photographs, no celebratory meals, only long, steady embraces and the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had happened to them all. Her achievement had not been erased, but it had been violently interrupted in front of the world. In the days that followed, messages flooded in from strangers across the country. Some were words of encouragement. Others were confessions of shared pain. Many came from students who had endured similar moments without cameras present, without witnesses ready to validate what they had always known but rarely been able to prove. The girl began to understand that while her humiliation had been public, so too was her truth. Her experience had become evidence where before there had only been suspicion. Investigations moved forward under intense scrutiny. Years of classroom behavior were re-examined. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence became impossible to ignore when viewed through the lens of public accountability. Testimonies accumulated. Records that had never been questioned were suddenly pulled into the light. What began as one act caught on live television unraveled a history far larger than a single moment. When the final decision was delivered, it did not come with the drama of broadcast television. It arrived in the language of official consequence: termination, findings of misconduct, mandatory review of institutional practices. For the educator, the fall was immediate and complete. The authority once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a legacy forever bound to a few seconds of recorded truth. Regret arrived not as a quiet personal realization, but as a permanent imprint in the public record. For the school reforms followed under the pressure of public demand. Bias training was made mandatory. Oversight committees were formed. Reporting structures were revised. None of these changes could undo the harm that had already been inflicted, but they stood as an admission that harm had been real, systemic, and long ignored. For the girl, recognition returned in a different form. A rescheduled ceremony was held months later without cameras, without spectacle. The award was placed into her hands at last, in front of classmates who now understood the significance of what she had endured. The applause that day was not shaken by shock. It was steady, resolute, and overdue. Her academic future moved forward, not because of sympathy, but because the excellence that had earned her the award had never truly been destroyed, only delayed. Yet the deeper impact could not be measured in certificates or statements. It lived in conversation. In classrooms that grew quieter when students spoke about fairness. In faculty meetings where assumptions were finally challenged instead of protected. In homes where parents used the clip as proof that what their children had felt was not imagined. The moment that was meant to diminish a child became a mirror held up to the world, reflected an injustice too familiar to be dismissed as anomaly. It forced witnesses to choose between passive viewing and moral response. Some looked away. Many did not. The girl would carry that night with her for the rest of her life, not as the story of an award destroyed, but as the night when a truth too often hidden was exposed in unforgiving light. She learned far earlier than she should have had to, that dignity is not always protected by authority, and that silence is most dangerous when it feels normal. The educator would carry it too, not as a private regret, but as a public consequence etched into permanent record. What was once done in the belief that no one important would challenge it became the very act that ensured the world never would forget. And so the torn certificate, once nothing more than paper, became something else entirely, a symbol of how quietly cruelty can travel and how loudly it must sometimes be confronted. It proved that injustice does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it announces itself with a simple, deliberate tear in full view of the world. The question that remained was not whether the act had been wrong. Was now undeniable. The question was what each new witness would do with the truth they had seen. Would they look at the moment as isolated tragedy, or as a warning, a responsibility, a call to refuse comfort and silence? Because silence had already been tried for generations. And in the end, it was not silence that changed anything. It was being seen.